he came back to Britain. He was arrested by Scotland Yard and taken to talk to Sir Basil Thomson, who was an extremely conservative man, and as a deputy prime minister of colonial Tonga had said that his closest friends were cannibals because they were so much more, reliable than these sort of, these town-educated missionaries he loathed as sort of, lily-livered types. They sat down together, and Ransome said, "Look, I'm not a Bolshevik. I'm not even a socialist. My godfather is Sir Arthur Ackland, former Minister of Education under Gladstone, a pillar of the establishment. I'm a liberal. And what I feel is that Britain's animosity towards the Bolsheviks, while understandable from an ideological point of view, is a waste of breath, that the Bolsheviks pose no threat to Britain, that the current British invasion of Russia, which was ongoing, the Allied intervention in Russia, military intervention in Russia, albeit at a fairly small scale, it is a waste of resources, it's a waste of men, it provides the Bolsheviks with a propaganda platform, it's appalling policy, and you need to talk to people like me who have the ear of the Bolshevik government. What do you think I'm doing for you guys in there? How am I earning my bread? With the Foreign Office, I'm getting close to these guys. I've just been, Ransome was the only British journalist to attend the inauguration of the Third Internationale, which was Lenin's vehicle for spreading revolution abroad. Now, of course, when Ransome was talking to the Soviet, he thought that the Third Internationale was a wonderful thing. He thought of himself as an internationalist. Well, he wasn't sure whether he was a revolutionary, but he thought of himself as an internationalist. But when he's talking to Basil Thomson, Sir Basil Thomson, Spycatcher Thomson, head of the yard, he says, "Well, I attended the Third Internationale, and it was comic opera. It was very amusing, a complete waste of time. You've got nothing to worry about. These guys, they're comedy figures. Really, they can't do us any harm. In fact, the more we attack them, the stronger we make them."
So, do you think that deep down he had principles, or was he ultimately a shape-shifting opportunist who was sort of dazzled by being in Lenin's company, but then when he went back to the British establishment, he could speak that language too? I mean, or do you think if you sort of scratch beneath that there was a sort of layer of principle or ideology that subtended everything else?
I think it's a very, very difficult question to answer. If you read the memoir literature from Ransome's period, the number of reliable witnesses is extremely small. There's a book by Bertrand Russell, written in 1920, after a visit to Russia, just called Bolshevism. And Russell is unequivocal in his condemnation of Bolshevism, and he's extremely lucid. He's very persuasive and convincing. He's also extremely rare. Most people who attacked Bolshevism in the press or in Britain, we would consider to be rabid jingoes. Yeah, I mean, Russell described himself as a communist at that time in that book, and he said the communist experiment in Russia had failed. Most of the people who fell on either side, those on the right, who wanted to just liquidate the Soviet and string them all up. I mean, that was the whites. That was the White Army. They just wanted to liquidate the Soviet. They were responsible for a vast number of atrocities. They were not a nice group of people. The Bolsheviks obviously were very extreme, and Ransome is in the middle. Now, does Ransome have any principles? At that time, I think that Ransome recognized that both the extreme left and the extreme right were extremely violent, and I think he felt that the extreme left had more stability to offer Russia than the extreme right. Now, in terms of whether Ransome possessed any personal principles, I think it's clear that Ransome did not commit absolutely to the Bolshevik ideology, and he certainly didn't commit to the white ideology. So what was Ransome's ideology? Well, I think Ransome's ideology was self-preservation. And whether you feel that that was an entirely selfish project, or whether you feel that basically he had no other alternative at that time, is a different question. I think that what Ransome lacked at that time was a certain ruthless capacity to investigate his own motives. I think Ransome was very keen on investigating other people's motives, but he very rarely looked inside himself. In fact, he explicitly said on several occasions that he was very reluctant to look inside himself and ask himself, why am I doing what I'm doing?
By the time he was completing the Swallows and Amazons series, 1 million copies of those books had been sold, so he must have done very well commercially. I wondered, is it possible for you to say whether you think that success and that reinvention brought him happiness?
That's an excellent question. It brought happiness to millions of readers. I mean, eventually, I think their millionth reader was 1947. So millions of people have loved Ransome's books. As to whether it brought him happiness personally, I think yes. The knowledge that he had created a series of novels as successful as these was incredibly valuable to Ransome. And in fact, when he was on his deathbed, it was the only thing that would really kind of provoke any reaction from him. It became the focus of his whole life. By the same token, it caused him great unhappiness, because it was a very limited world that he created. It was a very safe world, a very organised world, and it's obviously part of its enormous appeal. But Ransome simply excluded anything from that world which would deprive him of the happiness that he felt. It was his prize, really, not only for writing the books, but all the unhappiness that he had suffered before he wrote them. And amongst those people to be flung out of that particular Eden were the children who had originally inspired it, particularly their father, who Ransome really came to hate. He felt that Ernest Altunian was taking this credit away from him. But also, and perhaps certainly most sadly, his only child, Ransome felt that it was her duty to love him, her duty to accept what he gave her without asking questions. And particularly, I think, her duty to accept the kind of happiness that he had allotted for himself. And when she read Swallows and Amazons and told him that she thought it was tired and churned out, effectively, that she thought it was an artificial world and she didn't want to be part of it, he really never forgave her. And this scene was repeated again and again through their lives. I mean, she eventually sold the library, which he felt had been stolen from him by his first wife. She sold that library, and I mean, that was the end between them. But she sold it because he had given her no indication that he loved her. And she had actually offered this library to him, but offered to sell it to him because she wanted something from him. She wanted, I think, an apology. He never apologized, and he certainly wasn't going to pay for his books. So they were sold off in job lots for next to nothing by booksellers. And that was the end between them. And she died a very, very lonely woman.